It's Ken Harbaugh with the MeidasTouch Network. I want you to look closely at what is happening here as the leaders of the world's most important democracies gather for the G7 meeting. Trump stands apart, isolated, you might even say shunned. That cluster of people in the background, they're all surrounding President Zelensky of Ukraine. How the tables have turned. From early last year, when Trump tried to humiliate Zelensky in the Oval Office, telling him he had no cards, to today, as America's role as a global leader is collapsing amidst our surrender to Iran and our inability to defend our own allies. Ukraine has all the cards. Capitals across Europe, throughout the Middle East, even Taiwan, they're all looking to Ukraine for help in defending themselves against emerging threats, like the drone swarms Ukraine has learned to defeat. Inside Ukraine, the tide of battle is shifting. I've been reporting from the front lines for several years now, and have shared much of that here. But my latest story, just published by The Atlantic, was the toughest by far. It's about the resistance movement, Ukrainians fighting against the Russian occupation behind enemy lines, led largely by women. I'm incredibly grateful to The Atlantic for publishing the piece. As of yesterday, it was the #1 story on their site, but MeidasTouch played a key role as well. So for this episode of The Ken Harbaugh Show, I asked Joe Plenzler, my co-host over at Meidas Defense, to interview me about the article and how it all came together, including a wild story about how the Ukrainian resistance used a MeidasTouch Substack Live to verify my identity. This is an excerpt from a longer interview, which you can find over on the Meidas Plus Substack page. And if you want to read the full Atlantic piece, the link's below. Here's me and Joe Plenzler.
Ken, you're just back from Ukraine, and I heard you've got some really good news this weekend.
Well, yes, good news, I guess, with a caveat. It's good news in that the Atlantic has published a feature about the Ukrainian resistance that I wrote, but it's a tough story, and it was a tough trip. Honestly, the toughest of my trips. I've been going back and forth to Ukraine for a few years, and I mean, the toughest part is always realizing that when you return, there are going to be people that you hung out with the last time that you're never going to see again. But, you know, following the Ukrainian resistance, and this is a story I've been working on for a couple years now, it takes time to build that kind of trust with a group of folks who are taking, I mean, almost indescribable risks behind enemy lines, right? When you see some of these drone strikes that are hitting the news now, that's just the very last step in a long and complicated and really deadly kill chain for both sides. And the first part of that kill chain are these, often these incredibly heroic Ukrainian partisans behind enemy lines developing this intelligence.
Yeah, this is super timely. We just last week had Ralph Goff, the 6-time CIA station chief and Russia-Ukraine expert on the show. If folks haven't listened to that one, that would be a great interview for them to check into to get more information to set up the context for Ken's article coming out in the Atlantic. Ken, you opened your article with the cinematic story about Serhiy, right? This middle-aged Ukrainian intelligence officer who was catfishing a Chechen commander by the name of Ahmed by pretending to be a lonely housewife, if I recall correctly. So how did you first get access to these specific chat logs, the handlers? What did it look like on the ground?
Well, I'm glad you asked, because there are parts of the story that I wasn't able to include in the Atlantic article. And one of the most interesting to me, I mean, I just didn't want to make that too personal. The Atlantic is, hardcore journalism. In settings like this, we can get a little more personal. And the vetting process for one of my conversations with these partisans was really fascinating. And it's something I honestly should have expected. It's not as if they didn't trust like the person of Ken Harbaugh, but when you're communicating online, they need to make sure you're that person. Right. And I remember a particular message over an encrypted app which said, "We trust Mr. Harbaugh. We know who Mr. Harbaugh is. How do we know you're Mr. Harbaugh?" Right. Because, they're not seeing me. We're not talking. We're not in person. And I said, "Could we do a video call?" They said, "Absolutely not. But how about this? If the real Mr. Harbaugh puts this coded phrase in his next Meidas Substack Live, because we know that's actually him, we'll have someone watching." And it was obviously much tighter than this. They're very disciplined. We'll have someone watching, and, we'll know that you two are the same person. And so I put this coded phrase into the chat on the right side of the screen during one of those Meidas Defense Substack lives. And after that, the communication with that resistance cell flowed really easily. So they're very creative. They're very innovative. And Meidas itself had a part in validating this story, or at least my bona fides for the Ukrainian resistance.
It's always the challenge. And I've worked with enough national security reporters to know, like, it's important to tell the story of what they're doing. And it's important to protect themselves, right? So that we're not giving away locations, methods, and things like that. How did you navigate that dance?
It's a really tough one. The first thing I asked until the end when I sort of got it was, why are you talking to me? Yeah. This is the most dangerous work happening in the war right now. It's even, more dangerous than the assault guys. The first generation of partisans inside these occupied territories, there are almost none of them left. I mean, the FSB, the Russian security service, is incredibly brutal. Yeah. And they said there's a couple of reasons we're talking to you. First of all, we trust you. We know you won't expose current methods or identities, and I didn't. But there are other reasons they wanted this story out now. And for a long time, they have been very hesitant to talk about any of this stuff. But right now, first of all, they want the Russians to know that they are being watched by everyone. They want the Russians to be afraid wherever they go. They want that old lady carrying shopping bags by their barracks to be seen as a threat. I know that sounds counterintuitive, but they want that level of paranoia to infect the Russian occupiers. And read any story about resistance movements throughout history, and that is a key to it. Having that fear injected into the thought processes, into the decision loops of the occupiers. That's the first thing. And there's this incredible quote from one of the most notorious, if you're a Russian, partisans in Mariupol, who talks about exactly that, wanting them to live with that paranoia every second of every day. Hey everyone, quick break to say thank you. My last trip to Ukraine was made possible by those of you who signed up for my Substack page. There's a free option too, but the paid subs, which help cover my trips, start at just $8 a month, which actually goes a lot farther than you might think given how cheap it is to sleep in a trench. I'll be going back, and I'll also be posting frequent updates from the front until then. And we've got the Meidas Defense Weekly Substack Live on Wednesdays at 11 a.m. Check that out. And if you haven't yet, please subscribe to the Ken Harbaugh Show Substack channel. Your support is what makes all this possible. Back to the show. They also want Americans to know, and I think that's why they conceded to a piece in the Atlantic, that Ukrainians are fighting for their whole country, for Mariupol, for Crimea, for Donbass. They're fighting for all of it. And even though those areas don't often make the news, it's Ukraine. And there's this fear that a peace, and I'm putting that in air quotes on purpose, but that a peace will be imposed that surrenders these parts of their country. And for those people living there, that's not a peace at all. That is, for many of them, a death sentence. And they want us to know that Ukraine is all of Ukraine, not just the parts of it that Russia hasn't taken yet. And they will not accept a peace deal that surrenders part of not just their territory, but their families, their kids. One of the partisan commanders said, I want to be able to visit my grandfather's grave. And for me, it's about that.
You talked today about the resistance being, they're up against a pretty highly sophisticated Russian surveillance machine using like facial recognition, block by block tracking, polygraphing half the population of Mariupol. So the question is, like, as the occupation's dug in, how has the psychological toll changed for these partisans? And like, what does that do to a community psyche when, they're stripping out like yellow and blue markers out of the, products coming in, right? Like,
I got to believe it's incredibly lonely. The stress level must be through the roof. Try to imagine the Gestapo in Paris during World War II with AI, with high definition cameras on every single corner, and with torture chambers that they publicize. Instead of hiding them out of shame, the Russians actually put the bodies in the street outside their torture chambers in the morning as a signal to the Ukrainian people. That's how brazen and shameless they are. And you add to that their use of technology, and the camera network is one thing in particular that has just been devastating to those symbolic acts of resistance, because, even if you cover your face and you spray paint a Ukrainian flag, they will track your movements back in time to where you started, and they will round you up in your family. And you mentioned it, but in the first couple years of the occupation in Mariupol, you couldn't find blue or yellow paint. That's how paranoid the Russians were. They ripped blue and yellow markers out of aid packages to school kids. So, the psychological toll is pretty devastating, but they have adapted in some obvious ways, but some really innovative ways as well. Some of the partisans I talked to, in fact, most of them are in intelligence cells that reach their, logical minimum when it comes to autonomous intel gathering units. Some of these agents work entirely alone. They don't know anyone else in their network, even if they live in the same apartment building. All they know is that they have their handler, their contact, they communicate with over these encrypted apps, and that Russians are dying almost every day because of the intel, Russian occupiers, because of the intel they're providing. They know the network is vast. They know that they are a small but vital part of it. But it's not like they have group meetings, right? It's not like they can commiserate with their fellow partisans. It's not like the French resistance in that way. They are very, very alone for now.
The other thing that really stood out to me was the use of kids, right? Early on, when I was reading that part, it reminded me of young people in Northern Ireland trying to reject the British, right? Where, the two pastimes, if you talk to some of the old guard IRA guys, was like, we played soccer and we rioted. It was what our childhood was built around. But it seems like early on, the Ukrainians accepted kind of intel and help from kids, and now there's an absolute ban on that. Could you dive into that a little bit more? Because that was a pretty fascinating part of your article too.
Well, I want to reiterate that up front, an absolute ban on using kids in any way under the age of 18, even if they show up with an intel. The position of the Ukrainian resistance is not now. Like, you'll have your turn when you turn 18. And I remember vividly this conversation with this partisan commander when he said they'll get their turn when they're 18. And I said, their turn for what? And he said, their turn to be heroes, which hit me right here, because what he was saying was their turn to give their lives for their country. And it made me think of heroism in a totally different way. And, as a father of 3 kids, I don't want my kids ever to get their turn to be heroes. But the kids under 18 in these occupied territories were doing a lot of this symbolic resistance, spray painting this sign on the sides of buildings. This is a letter that only appears in the Ukrainian alphabet, not in the Russian alphabet, doing those kinds of things and taking enormous risks to do it. And the official Ukrainian resistance, at least the organized resistance, has said, knock it off. It's not worth it. I know it's a powerful gesture, but what's more powerful is a drone strike on a Russian barracks. And this commander actually said to me, and I put it in the piece, we need intel, not art. Yeah. So most of these overt signs of resistance, these symbolic acts, have gone away. If you play a Ukrainian song in public or with your window open, you can get taken to the basement. So that's not happening anymore. But instead, the resistance has become so much more quiet but lethal, because they're developing target coordinates. And they are directing these middle strike campaigns against these Russian occupiers, and kids aren't a part of it.
Yeah. What haven't we talked about this morning that you wanted to talk about?
Maybe I'll just leave you with one last observation / story about the Ukrainian resistance, because it stands in such sharp contrast to how our Pentagon under Pete Hegseth presents itself. And it's a story about humility. I was always nervous about the leaders that I served alongside or under who bragged, who talked a lot about themselves. They were the dangerous ones, right? They were the ones who got their units into trouble. And I'll share this story about a partisan I met in a cafe in Kherson under camouflage netting to hide from the omnipresent drones, Russian drones flying over the city. I had been told that this guy was a hero of the resistance. And when I first saw him sitting in the corner, I thought, I'm not sure what a hero of the resistance looks like, but this isn't what I had in mind. He wasn't the James Bond type. He was wearing farmer's coveralls, still had some dirt in him, a couple teeth missing. And I asked him, what he did as a partisan. And my first few questions, he just sort of dismissed. He's like, I wasn't a partisan. He said he wasn't in the resistance. I'm like, well, why are we talking? Why did people insist I talk to you? Maybe I have the wrong person. And it came out that during the opening weeks of Russia's invasion and occupation, he had had a farmhouse near a critical checkpoint, and he would see by day the Russians laying these mines to thwart Ukrainian counterattack. I mean, anti-tank mines. These things are heavy. I'm guessing they weigh like a bag of dog food weighs 40 pounds or something like this. They're not light. And at night, with no direction from anybody, this is why he, claimed not to be a part of the resistance. He would crawl through these fields and dig up these mines because he had remembered where the Russians had laid them, strap them on his back, tie them on his back with a rope, and crawl into the Russian positions and lay these mines next to Russian tanks so that when the Russians fired up their tanks the next morning, they would blow up.
Wow.
And I asked him, how many times did you do this? And he just smiled and said, many, many times.
Yeah.
And it was that degree of humility, that hesitancy to take any kind of credit. I mean, this person was never decorated. He was never recognized by the Ukrainian military or the Ukrainian government. He was just doing what he thought his country needed him to do with no consideration for like money or fame or attention. Obviously, word got out. People talked about him and made sure that I sat with him. But I imagine that story is repeated thousands of times across Ukraine. And hopefully Americans never need to rise to that level of heroism. But it's those small acts of defiance in this moment that I think will turn the tide. And I still believe, especially against the example of Ukraine and what they're dealing with in the occupied territories, that we have all the advantages of here in America, our resistance movement. We still have networks like this. We still have communication channels like this. We still have a First Amendment. And I have immense hope that we will be able to turn the tide and restore America. It's going to take a while, but restore America as that beacon of freedom and start to help our allies again instead of stabbing them in the back like we've done to Ukraine. That was an excerpt of my conversation with Joe Plenzler about my latest article in The Atlantic, The Warrior Witches of Ukraine's Resistance. For the full interview, check out the Meidas Plus or Ken Harbaugh Show Substack pages. The links are below. Thanks.
Want to stay plugged in? Become a subscriber to our Substack at MeidasPlus.com. You'll get daily recaps from Ron Filipkowski, ad-free episodes of our podcast, and more exclusive content only available at MeidasPlus.com.